I'm Monica Johnson with Marshall Weber, and this is Booklyn Calling. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to our show. This is a space where we talk about artists, libraries, and social justice. Marshall and I are your hosts and your guests. We're both artists, and we head up Booklyn Inc., an arts nonprofit located in Brooklyn, New York, on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. Let's see. So today we are going to talk to sTo Len. sTo is a printmaker, installation, sound, and performance artist with interests in improvisations and experimentation within a variety of media. His printmaking work updates traditional techniques such as suminagashi, just floating ink, and gyotaku, fish impressions, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, into an experimental collaboration with nature and a site of discourse on environmentalism and art activism. sTo Len was the first artist in residence at Alex Renew Wastewater Treatment Facility in Alexandria, Virginia, and took part in the field R&D program at Fishkills Park, a transformed landfill in Staten Island, New York. He's also a member of Works on Water, a group of artists and activists working with and about water in the face of climate change and environmental justice concerns. He is currently the new artist in residence at the New York City Department of Sanitation as part of the PAIR program, PAIR, with the Department of Cultural Affairs. And this, I can't wait to ask you about this, sTo, but first, hello, and how are you today?
Hi, I'm good. Nice to hear your voices.
So tell me where you are now and what you're doing.
I'm doing an art residency at a place called Level Retreat, which is, it was started in 2016. I think I'm only the 10th resident artist here, but it's in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And, I was born in Danville, Virginia. And so, I kind of grew up coming down here and stuff. So every time I come down here, which I realize I haven't been here in about 15 years, which is kind of crazy, but every time I come down here, I kind of, it's like a trip down memory lane a bit. But so I'm here, I'm partnering with, there's a river cleanup group called the Ha River Assembly, and they just had their 32nd annual river cleanup. And so I kind of talked to them a few months ago, because I'm only here for 2 weeks, and it's this kind of thing where I want to collaborate with people here. I want to collaborate with the place, but I have such a limited time span. So I contacted them about the river cleanup, and I sent them these bags that I made in advance because I wasn't going to be there for the actual cleanup. And, I told them, as you're cleaning up, and this is like 300 plus volunteers, wow. 29 locations, I think it's like 60 miles of river. If you see anything of potential, however you sort of think of these objects that might have potential life as an art collaborator, save them for me. So, when I arrived, it was like Christmas. Like I had these like 10 bags full of stuff, and the residency is cool enough to allow me to break all this stuff out here. And I've just been going through it all, kind of like this, pseudo privy pit archaeologist, they're just like, what is this? What is that? And like, and what's cool though, is that, I'm used to kind of pulling these things out myself, but to think that, these other people were like picking these things up and going, this one, this is for sTo. Sort of like a very like a warm, kind of like intimate thing. And so I've been cataloging this stuff and also making prints with it.
Wait, can you name some of what is the stuff? What kind of stuff was pulled for you?
Today I was cataloging the toys. There's tons of toys. little
Wow.
dinosaurs, SpongeBob. SpongeBob always shows up, I feel like.
Always. Yeah.
There were those they're like little beanbag things you throw in a hole. There's like that game. I don't know. There was a bunch of those beanbags. Always shoes. There's always like Adidas flip-flops. Which they're great for printmaking because they have great patterns on the bottom.
Oh, right.
There's always like the one lost shoe, tons of left foot shoes. I always find more left feet than right feet for some reason. But a lot of left-footed flip-flops, tires, a lot of bottles and cans, which aren't great for printmaking, but some of them are really old. So like I found a really old Rolling Rock can today, probably from the 50s. I don't know. What else? Balloons, metal objects that I don't know what they are, and foam, lots of styrofoam, of course, of varying degrees of wetness and smell.
Oh, God. Ew.
Yeah. So I kind of always set up a whole station of good smelling things to combat, and I knew this was going to be extra stinky because it had been sitting in these bags for a couple weeks. Mm-hmm. So I've got like some good smelling herbs and incense going to sort of balance it out.
So STo, can we pull back and can you explain to folks this? Because you have a lot of alternative printing practices that relate to ecology and environmentalism. So can you explain the printing from objects and trash and rivers and bodies of water?
Yeah, totally. So, I think for me, the entry point was suminagashi, which is a Japanese printmaking technique that dates back to like the 12th century. And so I was into printmaking, but I was always kind of a terrible printmaker. Like I'm a terrible etcher. I'm really not a good silk screener. I'm horrible at, like registration. It's just the worst. And so when I discovered kind of by accident printing with water, and it was kind of like really freeing and sort of no rules kind of, I was like, oh my God, this is my jam, no registration needed, freestyle, improvise, urgency, all these kinds of things that just spoke to me. And, from there I had been spending so much time down by the water in New York City that I realized just from looking at the water so much that I was essentially trying to make what I saw in bodies of water like the Newtown Creek in New York, the formation of the pollution and stuff on the surface of the water. I had been doing that in the studio. So that kind of like was a revelation to go out in a boat and try to print with the actual waterway. And that kind of set me on the trajectory of what I'm doing now, and I think I went to Vietnam for the first time in 2015. And that was a big deal. I'm half Vietnamese and I had never gone there. But while I was there, one of the sort of crushing realities was how terribly polluted the water is there. It makes, the Newtown Creek in New York look like really clean. So, there's like, just seas of single-use plastics basically. And foam, like so much styrofoam and takeout containers and plastic bags. But I kind of, it's so overwhelming when you see that. And it's like, what can you do? These people are just living in it with it. And they're also bathing in it. And, it was really shocking and kind of hard to like, accept. But, when I came back, I kind of got into Gyotaku, which is a fish impression printmaking technique where people people who fish in Japan, and this dates back to, I guess, like the 18th century, they would print the actual bodies of fish. And it was kind of a way to record the fish that they caught, as well as, make an artwork. And I think that was somehow like therapeutic for me. I had seen like these huge fish kills in Vietnam, 60 tons of dead fish. And it was so disheartening. But I kind of came back like trying to deal with that through art. And because I don't really fish, but I do fish out garbage. I started to kind of do that same idea, which is inking the fish or the object and sort of rubbing out a print using the textures of that object. And the similarities between kind of capturing the textures of things like styrofoam and the scales of a fish, were really kind of apparent as soon as I started doing that. And I think, for me, I'm like a prolific artist, but I kind of move really slowly through ideas in a way. It's like years. I'm just kind of like pushing through these ideas. And so, but I get really obsessed. So I've been super obsessed with this the past couple of years, and it's turned into a printmaking practice that is about indexing kind of like these like castaway objects from society, from lives, and it in a way becomes some kind of, I don't know, like a pictorial writing system or something. It's like a image-based abstract language that's in some way documenting these things that we all, know and know that it get thrown out, but like kind of can ignore because it's usually, nestled in a shoreline along a body of water that people don't really go to. So,
can we talk about how gross that is? Like, I mean, it's like, I've known you long enough and your work long enough and I've seen it and there's so much beauty in it. But, I think we're just kind of like, I'm like, my face is all screwed up. Like, ew, man, and it makes, I mean, what is that like? Are you actually printing with dead fish that are all stinky? And like, what is your body's relationship to all this trash that sounds like you're saying these are your tools for your art practice? And like, I don't know, do you have to get special shots before you go to your residency? Like, how do you care for yourself within these polluted landscapes, because you are on the front lines of this stuff by choice. I mean, in some ways we're not, but this is your chosen practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's real. I think I don't get special shots, but I do, I do wear, thick chemical gloves when dealing with things. I do wear a respirator if I'm out, at the site, on the water and stuff. But, for the most part, it's just being super, super careful. I feel like I'm always working sort of slowly and methodically and really mindfully because, you don't want to, I don't know, like touch your mouth or like, like kind of, even just touch your face at all or, so I think when I'm working, I'm like trying to be super mindful of what I'm doing and not put myself in any danger, especially if I'm like, say, on a boat in the middle of, a super fun site. I've never, knock on wood, fallen into the water, but, that's the kind of thing that could happen.
When you think about what traditional printmakers use in their materials, I can't imagine that it's less toxic than the types of things that you're using. But like,
that's true.
You may have arguably like a safer practice because of the cultural stigma of like what trash is and what pollution is and what dead fish implicate. So
yeah, that's kind of true, actually. I mean, the acids that people use for etching and, I've known, we all know people who've had respiratory illnesses from etching and the hazards of the artist vocation are real.
Well, it's interesting because there's such a holistic kind of approach in your work. I mean, part of those dead fish and that pollution is from papermaking and printmaking facilities.
That's right.
Right. But I wanted to put a few images in the viewers' minds to kind of explain what STo is doing. So with Suma Nagashi, typically people are working with what is in the European parlance marbling, right? So you're floating ink on water, and then you're dipping the paper into that water and you're pulling up the ink. So with STo, what you have to imagine is that here's STo, and he's, let's say, in Queens on Newtown Creek, which is it's part of a Superfund or near a Superfund site. It's an incredibly polluted body of water between Queens and Brooklyn. Yeah. And there's so much oil, refuse stuff floating on the river that STo can dip a piece of paper into the river and pull out an image. The paper attracts the oils. And I find this like completely amazing, that you can, that the beauty of that print reflects this kind of nightmare. And this is a body of water that I know fairly well. I used to live near it. And there's signs by it that say, it's just like, don't go in the water, don't eat fish you get from water. But I recall one sign that just remains etched in my mind that said, if you get water from the creek on your skin, go and wash it off immediately with clean water.
Jeez.
It's an actual sign.
Yeah,
I'm seeing a picture of STo on your website right now, pulling a print from what might be the Newtown Creek, but you're like, I even think your feet have plastic bags on it or something, and your hands have rubber gloves on it, and you're smiling, and it's beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, there is that. I mean, I think that the dichotomy between like terrible beauty, that's always been sort of fascinating to find making something beautiful out of something so horrible.
This other piece that you did is you did these huge scrolls where you were printing with all these objects that were pulled from waterways, and they're really beautiful, and they kind of reminded me of the work of the Chinese artist Xu Bing and other artists who do these giant scroll works, which is, you have contemporary Chinese and many antiquity Asian artists using these giant scrolls. But it was very interesting. I saw, this is really beautiful. And there were the language elements you talked about before. But then at a certain moment, I was looking at it and I had this realization that, wait, this is like literally a river of trash. Like, all this stuff represents stuff that have been pulled out of a body of water somewheres. And so it's almost like, even in looking at your work, the audience, the reader is like flipped back and forth between this contrast. And I know that you are really aware of this. And I know that you have a whole theoretical kind of construct behind this, as well as an activist orientation. So can you talk about what I know you have called yourself a hydro-feminist? So I wonder if you could talk about that more theoretical relationship to this material practice you have.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think for me, my journey to back to home, to Vietnam, to Asia, had a huge impact on me on many levels. One of them was kind of really reclaiming that part of my identity, which I hadn't really wrestled with really my whole life until really kind of stepping foot in Vietnam again for the first time, right? It's like I've like grown up with the culture, but never having been there. And so that hit me across the head in a really powerful way. And I think through that reclaiming of my Asian identity, leaning into Asian aesthetics and like, going back and looking at these old printmaking techniques that come from Asia, and just really kind of like naturally falling into that and then wanting to subvert it. That was really like conscious decisions for me. But I think what was surprising was like how over time I started to see how the water was actually leading me. Like it was like, okay, it was the theme of the work. And I began calling it my collaborator, and I began to like understand by floating down a river how you have to improvise. You have to like take the bend, you got to float with it, right? And you've got to like be prepared for that, so that you don't flip the boat or whatever. And so in spending more and more time in water, dealing with the sort of unexpectedness of traversing these waterways, that are dangerous, and so I think I was learning how to improvise. I was learning how to kind of act urgently. I was learning how to really trust the process of intuition. And the more I was allowing myself and acknowledging water as the sort of, spirit, if you will, like the more I was acknowledging this connection to it, the more I was able to understand about my heritage, the more I was able to kind of be fluid in art making, in this way that beyond printmaking, I definitely worked in these other mediums. And it was the first time I was able to really flow back and forth between all these different processes and see their connection. And, I think a part of that idea of hydro-feminism is rejecting this idea of control, which is sort of, it's sort of like at the heart of, I think, the Anthropocene. It's like control and ownership and owning water and owning land and these resources that you can kind of, think of things that you can just own and sell and, use up. So yeah, it was for me, like water kind of being this guide, not to be cheesy, but it's like true, really sort of like allowing myself to follow that as a guide. And, this has been like 7 years now. And in the water as a, medium / collaborator has taken me to Vietnam 5 times since, for art projects, for exhibitions, for, crazy boat rides down the Mekong Delta. It's taken me here to Chapel Hill. It's like sort of like flowed, through the work and allowed me to sort of like, continue to evolve in new ways. So yeah, it's more than just, sort of a subject matter that I'm interested in. I think it's like literally some kind of guide.
Mm-hmm. So I want to flow backwards a little, because you've been doing the Sumanagashi for a while and these projects for a while. And part of that practice is you make books. And even before that, you were always involved with the book form when you were running the Cinders Gallery. You were kind of one of the first, dare I say, hipster galleries in the Williamsburg scene that had a really vibrant zine culture and artist book culture. And, Booklyn and Cinders kind of found each other at the beginning of this, and via curator Amy Lusty, and then through myself, there was a lot of interchange between Cinders and Booklyn. And you had a few solo shows at Booklyn, and
and let's not forget the best title for a show ever made: Ass Hats for Shitheads. And that was before my time at Booklyn. So I'm glad you're kind of getting there. I've always wanted to ask, what in the heck? Where did that come from?
I got a lot of flack for that title, actually.
From
People
who?
hate it. People hated that title. They hated it.
People
hated it.
No, yeah.
Amy didn't hate it. No, like friends of mine were like, dude, your work's so beautiful. Why are you using this stupid name? But, there's a thing about me, like, I if you like ever look at the titles of my pieces, they're always playful or like, like sort of like humoristic. I mean, you got to have a sense of humor in this line of work,
Yeah.
Yeah, it jumps off the map of your and your CV. There's all these nice names of your shows, except for This Black Hole is Sucking predated Ass Hats for Shitheads. So, but then there was The Joy of Life, Bend in the World, Forming, The End Papers, Suminagash. Like everything is very on. So something was happening in 2009 for The Black Hole is Sucking show. And then in 2014 for Ass Hats for Shitheads.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have to mention during one of those sucking periods, I remember when your studio was a crappy paper mache replica of one of the places where you lived.
Yeah. Oh my God, yes.
down to the appliances. And it was like you had built this fake home around you in your studio. And it was like this awful parody. You gave me one of the pieces and it was a real can of Cafe Bustillo, but you had paper mache'd it and then crudely painted the label back on it.
Oh my God, yes. I'm so glad you were there for that, Marshall. Yeah, I was going through some shit. I think, like getting displaced, having to deal with all these objects, making lots of work, making sculptures, and then just sort of, not having space for them. And then living with your art in that way where, I just started making duplicates of the real things in my life, which doesn't make any sense, but somehow I was figuring things out that way. That's funny.
So, again, on the Booklyn connection, there's another connection that you and I have, in that you have recently been a guest of the Organik art group, which is sort of a precursor, but also a spin-off of Booklyn. Like 3 people, Kurt Allerslev, Christopher Wilde, and myself, are collaboratively making books, usually having to do with environmental issues. And Christopher Wilde had procured all these cartographic navigation maps from the 90s and had made collages with them and collaged them together. And then he gave them to you, and you did amazing sumagashi on them. And then me and Kurt took them back, and then we did rubbings on them and kind of did these meditations on ecology. And so it seems like you're doing these kinds of projects with lots of people all the time. So can you speak to why you have this kind of what drew you to zines, what drew you to the book arts, what drew you to Booklyn, and the book form as being part of your practice?
Yeah. I mean, it is a huge part of my art world, and I gotta say that those Organik books were so fun to do. I love them so much. They came out amazing. And that was fun too, because Christopher sent me those maps and I spent a whole summer printing on them. And, they're maps, and then I'm printing these sort of like water forms on top. And it was like creating new bodies of water and islands and things, like interacting with the old maps. I just love that. And then I forgot about it. I sent it to Christopher, and I don't know, it was like 2 years later, 3 years later, they've become this amazing book. And I was sort of flabbergasted because I just kind of forgot about it. But, I think some of the first art that I ever really made was in zine form. As a kid, my first printmaking was with the Xerox machine, and I was like, oh my God, I got one of those Kinko's cards with $100 on them that you could get for $10 from someone who worked there. And I would spend so many hours chilling at Kinko's, doing all kinds of weird Xeroxes, 3rd, 4th generation Xeroxing, just sort of breaking images down, shredding the visuals of that stuff. And I started making zines, at 14, 15 with photos and bad poetry and and then kind of this little angsty teen handing them out to people that I hated and liked, at school. And
wait, why would you hand them out to people you hated?
Because I wrote shit about them that I wanted them to read, you know?
You were like passing them hate mail?
Pretty much, yeah.
I've never heard of that use of zine making, but I love it.
Yeah.
So much for
like
forming
therapy.
Community.
Yeah, I know.
Well, it's therapy, right?
It was therapeutic here.
Yeah.
You know, like they probably never read it, you know. I would go to the Greyhound bus station and sell them, like as people were waiting in line. Yeah.
Oh,
I'd be like
reading material from a
$1.
14-year-old?
Yeah. Yeah. $1, folks, you know, like which it's hilarious thinking back on that. But yeah, that was to me like, wow, this is really empowering. You know, it was like becoming your own media, you know, all that kind of revelatory stuff when you first discover it. And the fact that you could disseminate it. I think for me, I was, wow, you can make multiples. You can make so many and drop them around, you know, and I would bring them to punk shows and, you know, just sort of leave them places. I would go to like Borders Books and leave them in the magazine racks, you know, for someone to find. Yeah, I just got really into that. It was really accessible, you know, and it was sort of like an easy, cheap way to make prints. And then, you know, I sort of took a break from that stuff for a while. But then when I moved to New York and started Cinders in 2004, I was really wanting there to be a gallery that also had zines, because I felt like there were a lot of really cool books being made. There was a lot of interesting art being put into book form that was hard to get. You know, I mean, in New York at the time, there was See Here in the Lower East Side that I like to go to, and I think that closed. And weirdly, you know, besides Printed Matter, there weren't that many places to go, and there certainly weren't galleries that had books. And you know, that was a big thing. I was like, we're totally going to have a book section. We're going to make zines with shows as our little catalogs for shows and things. And it was a cool way to connect with artists from all over the world. You know, send me your books, I'll sell them. And so, yeah, it became part of a network, you know, of bookmakers. And Booklyn was certainly a part of that in New York City, discovering you guys. And, you know, that was like, we thought, wow, Booklyn's got it together, man. They're like, yeah,
that's awesome
really,
that you thought that.
Well, yeah, I mean, like
That's what we thought of Cinders.
Yeah, we were really scrappy, you know, but like we were like, it's awesome working with Booklyn because they really like know what's up, you know.
We totally do.
Yeah, you do. I was not wrong.
I don't know if we did then.
Yeah, we were all figuring it out, you know. But
but I remember first going to Cinders and looking at your little store, and like, you know, we had this conversation, and it was just like, Le Dernier Cray. Oh, we know that guy. Wait, you know, Bangu. We know that, you know, oh my God, you know, just all these people, you know, we're like a mile away. We're representing like a dozen of the same artists.
Yeah.
Until we met each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we had no idea.
We had no idea, you know, and that was really sort of pre-social media and all that stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
So it means.
What years were these guys? Was this like 2007 through 14-ish?
Yeah, aughts. You'd call them the aughts.
The aughts, 2004.
Okay.
We met in 2005 or so, Marshall, something like that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those years. And, you know, I remember getting shit from people for selling books. They were like, well, are you a bookstore or are you a gallery? You know, you have to choose. I was like,
who are these people? Who are these people who don't like asshats for shitheads who disagree with selling books?
Those are the fucking shitheads. Yeah.
People have too much free time.
This is pre-New York Art Book Fair, you know, and
yeah,
it was a different climate. People didn't understand that art books are art, you know, that artists can make books, that zines are really kind of an amazing art form. And I remember people actually saying that, like,
and it's interesting
sort of
how quickly in the rear view, I feel like that awareness is completely gone.
I love not having to explain to people what zines and artist books are, because that was a giant time waster.
That is good.
Yeah, we won. We won. We were right all along.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Do you feel like motivated to do this work because it brings about awareness? Like something so beautiful can also have such devastating effects on our environment and our bodies and our lives. Is it sort of like dancing on the ashes of late stage capitalism? Is it like, is it an effort to be optimistic within a space that makes it increasingly difficult to feel that way?
Yeah. I mean, those, in a lot of ways, pretty much everything you touched on are things that I think about and consider. And, it is partly like, a fuck you to capitalism, just to be out there. I feel like people are like, what are you doing when they see me, and it's partly just to be bearing witness, and acknowledging, in these different ways. And it's partly because it is fun. I mean, it's like I'm not in a white cube, you know what I mean? I'm doing adventures, I'm traveling. It's kind of like all the things that I like to do, including bringing awareness, which is still real. I mean, here in Chapel Hill, I've already talked to people who, we've organized a few river walks, and I'm like, yeah, I like to get to know, the area and stuff like that. And people are already telling me here, like, oh, that was great. I haven't really gone to this location, or I haven't spent time thinking about this stuff. So I feel like there's still a relevance there, just in terms of really simply sharing a different way of looking at things, sharing that perspective, bringing awareness. That being said, I'm not interested in just being the dirty water guy, either. Like, I do feel myself, and this is maybe a good segue to the sanitation residency, but I feel myself more interested in collaborating with people, like I've spent a lot of time collaborating with landscapes and kind of almost giving them personhood. But in some ways, that could kind of go on forever. But, I think, like, I'm not going to say I'm nearing an end of that series, but it is, it's sort of like the similarities of each place, begin to kind of make things homogenous or something, like, it's like, yes, there's dirty water everywhere. Prints might look a little different, but it's to me, it's all part of this conversation. But at the same time, I'm always like thinking, like, what's going to really be challenging for me. And so always the loner kind of artist, like, I think collaborating with Organik was one of my first, like, sort of larger collaborations with people, in a way. And now I'm like full on. I mean, I'm like trying to collaborate with 10,000 people at the sanitation department. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So, I applied and I got the public artist residency for the Department of Sanitation. And I'm the first one in this program. It's the first time they're doing it through the PAIR program, right? Which is the Department of Cultural Affairs program. Started in 2015, and they've done different city agencies, like the Office of Immigration, the Department of Records. This is the first year they've done sanitation. And it's, this whole program is inspired by Meryl Latimer Euclid's work as the Department of Sanitation artist in residence, which she still is. This is like 40 years later. She started in 1977, and I think maybe the first artist to really embed themselves in a city agency. So I was,
and just to clarify,
in,
this is
yes.
PAIR is the Public Artist in Residence program, where, like,
yes.
an artist is paired with a public or with an office, and that ranges throughout the city. Yeah,
I think there's about 3 departments chosen a year since 2015, and Yeah. And so, it's extra special because it is the sanitation department, and Meryl casts a really big shadow. I mean, she's got 40 years of artwork created, about and with the sanitation department. So for me, stepping into this role, I didn't know what to expect. I tried to be super open-minded, but I did think like, oh, trash, like I'm going to be working with garbage potentially, and this is something that people always ask me. But the reality is I can't even touch the garbage. I've essentially, when I first started, I was like, I want to know everything. I want to go everywhere. I want to talk to everybody, and so I've been in research mode where I've basically followed the trail of waste from our curb to the truck to the waste transfer station to a barge to an incinerator or to a landfill, and throughout that whole process, I'm not actually allowed to touch the trash because it's dangerous. And I mean, I did ride-alongs on the collection trucks, and I'm like interviewing the guys. I'm just standing around taking photos, and then I'm like, oh, can I help you guys? This kind of sucks. I'm like, you guys are doing all this heavy lifting, and I'm just standing around, and they actually wouldn't let me. It's union rules, but it is also really dangerous, etc. So I've really had to sort of like change my focus from objects, landscapes, these sort of like spaces to a 10,000 person workforce, who are actively, dealing with 12,000 tons of garbage a day, so that's been really interesting. And I'm fully embedding myself in this world, I've shown up, almost 5 days a week, every week. I've traveled to all the different, I mean, there's so many garages I haven't been to, but I've been going to lots of different garages. I have a studio in the central repair shop, which is where all broken things go. It's amazing. It's this, they love to say it's the size of the Empire State Building if it was on its side, but we're talking bays and bays of garbage trucks that have like blown up, that are, were caught on fire because people improperly disposed of, propane tanks or whatever.
Oh my God.
There's broken electronics, is broken, kind of everything. And so that's a cool place for me to be and just sort of witness the maintenance of maintenance, those are like probably the most unseen workers in the department because they're fixing everything behind the scenes. So there's upholsterers, there's metalsmiths, there's machine shops where they're building parts specifically for the trucks. And I'm in the screen printing shop. Ironically, I've been screen printing there, but no one's used this screen printing shop for 25 years. So I've kind of like, everything's done digitally, they used to hand silk screen the trucks, the signs, everything. Now Wow. It's all digital. It's all vinyl lettering. And so they didn't even have lights on. I was like, they're like, yeah, you can use this room. We'll throw everything out, and I was like, no, don't throw anything away. Sanitation workers want to throw everything away, right? I was like, don't throw anything away. Just give me lights. And they gave me like lights, and it's a gold mine of there's all the old screens that they used to use. There's, old photos, old signs, lots of unused metal signs. And so I've been having a ball kind of doing these remix prints of using all the old stuff, And so, but anyways, like really kind of what my focus is communicating with the workforce and setting up a way to collaborate. So far, they have they're called smart boards, and they're flat screen TVs that are in a lot of the garages and a lot of the different buildings. And it's, it's where you have like daily updates, you have people's schedules go on there and stuff. And I asked if I could make content for the screens. So I've been making these video missives where it'll be like static, and then my face shows up and I'm like, hi, I'm your artist in residence, and I've been asking people questions. I've been asking the employees, questions and kind of like telling them about what I'm looking at, what I'm interested in. And there's a phone number people can call and like leave me messages. I have a sanitation email where people can email. And I'm kind of just like working on this relationship where eventually I'm going to be asking for submissions for these video missives from the employees and then doing like trying to set up a situation where we can collaborate either with the videos or with prints or with me visiting their specific jobs and kind of like hanging out with them. So yeah, it's interesting. I'm really turning my focus towards people, and I'm less interested in just making my art and instead like opening it up to see what happens if I try to collaborate with people who aren't artists, or people who I might not even agree with politically about stuff, but like what happens if we sit in a room and make something, So
I just have like kind of a human interest question. Does the Department of Sanitation want you there? Like how are they taking to an artist kind of being around? You're going on ride-alongs, looking at and just recognizing that, the sanitation union in New York City is one of the strongest, best paid. Its history as taking out the garbage of one of the most populated and corrupt city in the entire world. Do you really want an artist kind of nosing around and being like, what's going on, guys? I'm curious because these are ideas that I carry with me. Like how does that feel? What is your day-to-day like? What's the culture there? And do you feel like you were just kind of plopped in there and now you're trying to figure it out? Or is the culture more responsive to an artist and welcoming to that in your experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, those are great questions. I think I was a little intimidated, to be honest, like when I first started going to these spaces, because, I mean, for the most part, I would say people are really, really cool. People have been super friendly and have welcomed me with open arms. My first place, and I have an office desk in the records management department, and they've been really a good kind of base for me in the like sort of office civilian workforce of sanitation. And that's like where they keep the archives of things like old, all the old, there used to be a magazine called Sweep, all the old photos and all that kind of stuff. And so that's been a cool place.
Wait, there was a Department of Sanitation magazine called Sweep?
Yes. And it's
That's
so
incredible.
good. I want to make a book of all this stuff because, I mean, and there's like amazing graphic design. It was in the 60s, Sweet magazine. But anyways, that's been fascinating to be there, and they've been really welcoming. I've met the commissioner, everyone there for the most part. I mean, people are doing their job, so you're kind of like, I'm always very conscious to not overstep my boundaries or sort of like be in the way. But I've also been like, can I go there? Can I be here? And they're like, okay, I was like, I'm always asking for things. And, for the most part, people are really, they're kind of like, okay, that's cool that you want to do that, and, I've like walked into the wrong garage before and people have been like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, I'm a friendly guy. I'm like, hey guys, I'm the artist in residence. And they like, it's just like the music stops, it's like, and, what the fuck does that mean? I've gotten that a little bit, I was in a break room one time and this one guy was really busting my balls about my hair. Like,
okay, you have to describe your hair first. What does your hair look like that he was busting your balls?
It's a spiky kind of mess of a hair ahead of spiky
and
black
to me
hair.
feels like appropriate for the Department of Sanitation, but go on.
Yeah, but I mean, these are like, in this situation, it was like working class guys from Long Island, and they were like, "What the fuck happened to you?" Like, and it's like, hey, I've been walking around like this, for practically my whole life. I'm pretty used to that, and it doesn't really faze me. But like, there's an element of winning people over, that I've had to work for sure. There's an element of, I mean, at first people were kind of like, you're not supposed to be here, especially in the central repair shop where I am now. But, you keep showing up, and I even made myself my own uniform.
Can you describe your uniform, please?
Yeah, it's what you would call a battle vest, which is like, it's a vest with patches all over it. But they're all trash related patches that I've been collecting, along with of old school sanitation patch, which I get a lot of cred for having that.
So this residency goes through, it's 2021 and 2022 for the whole years.
Yeah, it started technically it started September 21 and technically goes to September 22, although they said, the funding is up then, but like if sanitation's cool with it, I can continue to work and, find other funding or what have you. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I just applied to the Creatives Rebuild initiative.
Yeah.
For art. Yeah. And there's an artist employment program. So I'm trying to do that. Because I feel like the projects I want to do are so big, and there's a whole film archive that is on like all these obsolete video formats that I really want to digitize, because it's like, it's a gold mine of footage, we're talking from 1930 up until the early aughts. It's sitting in film canisters and like crazy beta tapes and, but it's just sitting there, and I'm like, wow, we really got to digitize this stuff. So that's a big project.
And what archive is that in?
It's in a closet, actually. It's in there was an old TV studio at Sanitation that they used to do. Oh, it's a
Department of Sanitation.
Yeah, Department of Sanitation. Yeah.
Wow.
I was thinking, because, some of our past shows have been about queer ecology and about union movements. And it's interesting how there's always resonance between the shows. And so I'm just thinking about, we did a big show about artists working with the teachers' unions. And then the Queer Ecology Hanky Project was kind of looking at queer biology and queer culture. And one of these things, especially with your work, STo, that really kind of, seems to be resonant with me is this kind of issue of indigenous and Native American consciousness and the water keepers, and this idea of what American ecology would look like. Because especially with the water work that you're doing and the whole water keeper movement, it seems to be so aligned. And you've confronted all these kind of areas of, contestation and conflict in your work. And and yet you've pulled out, with your mostly positive attitude, you've pulled out some really beautiful artworks, and it's very impressive. And I also wanted to just, I want to hear you speak on that, but I also wanted to note that you have this whole other sort of practice as a musician, where you are like, and a producer. You're producing shows, you're producing public events that involve your other practices, and, you've been a curator. And so it's kind of funny to hear you describe yourself as not working so much with people or not often collaborating with people, whereas I always thought of you as like a fairly high profile person, especially in the kind of Brooklyn, gallery and art scene. And you've always held a really interesting position there because, you've kind of floated between all these different worlds in that scene, and between the activist world and the high art world. And for a minute, it seemed like Cinders was like the cool gallery that everybody invited to be part of their shows because they didn't know anyone else who was cool. And it's just interesting that you've bounced from all these different places, and just the water metaphor comes back again and again and again, just like the floating around kind of thing. And so, and then you end up using water itself as a medium, and that flow takes you to sanitation. And I don't know, it's just, when we step back and look at all the people we've engaged with, whether we've known them personally or not, it's so interesting from a wider perspective, like how coherent people's lives and their practices are.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. And I mean, yeah, it's funny because you brought up, that you saw me as someone who works with a lot of people. And you're right in a sense. I think that stuff is informing my artwork now. But at the time, I think my art was really made in isolation. And then the other work I was doing, curating and having a space and creating opportunities and space for other artists that I believed in, was the social aspect of my world, but art making was always sort of private. And now I'm sort of melding those worlds, which feels really great. It feels really natural. And really real. I think when I did the Freak the Creek event last October, it was sort of an illegal guerrilla event down by the Flushing Creek with bands. We had a generator, we had free food. I got the City Artist Corps grant and was able to pay everybody really well, which always feels good. And that was kind of like a lot of my interests. It was music. I got to perform. I got to invite lots of people there. It was totally free. I got to feed people, and we got to be by the water, and there were boats, and it was just, I was like, yes, this is like my jam. This is exactly what I want to go to. But that was a real pleasure to do. And so, yeah, I think it is interesting when we start to look back at things, and in the moment you're just sort of doing it, flowing from one project to the next. But I think if you're not trying too hard to like be something, like if you're not trying to like, I'm gonna be blah, 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 like if you're really honestly making honest marks and decisions and just sort of going from one thing to the next, it's a pretty natural flow. And it's fun. I don't really think about it that often, but it's fun just like talking to you guys and like looking back on all that stuff. Yeah, you really start to see the connections. And there's so much more I want to connect with. I mean, I want to connect with more water protectors of the world. I want to connect with more Indigenous communities of the world who are doing such good work. And I think that's something that I'm super excited to continue to pursue.
Well, I feel like we are about to say goodbye. We have covered a ton of stuff. And
Yeah,
God, I don't even want to ask Marshall if there's any closing thoughts because I know how long that takes. Well, hey, thanks, Sto, so much for meeting us again. And thank you, everyone who's listening, to help us through these first stages of having our very own podcast, Booklyn Calling. It's been a pleasure. Check out the show notes for ways to connect with Sto Len. And if you want to see his battle vest from Department of Sanitation, I actually found a picture of it on your website, Sto. So we'll be sure to put the link in the show notes. And as usual, if you're a librarian or a curator and you work at an educational institute and you're interested in collecting STo's work or others like it, you can email us at hello@booklyn.org, or you can check out our entire collection on Booklyn's website, which is booklyn.org. And we'll see you next time. This podcast was made possible in part by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and in partnership with the City Council, and from individual donors to Booklyn, Inc. You can support this podcast by making a donation at booklyn.org/donate.